The tiny American flags burst into flames like dying stars against the summer sky. Their red, white, and blue fabric curling into ash as 7-year-old Marcus watched his symbol of pride disappear forever. The acrid smell of burning polyester mixed with barbecue smoke, creating a toxic cloud that seemed to choke the very spirit of Independence Day from Oakwood Heights' usually pristine community park. "You haven't earned the right to wave that flag yet," Patricia Whitmore declared, her manicured fingers still clutching the silver lighter that had just destroyed 3 children's parade decorations. Her blonde hair remained perfectly coiffed, despite the July heat. Her white linen blazer spotless, even as she stood surrounded by the charred remains of what had been innocent childhood joy. "When you contribute something meaningful to this community, then we'll talk about patriotism." Marcus's sister, Amelia, only 9 years old, stared at the smoking remnants of her craft project with tears streaming down her cheeks. They had spent the entire morning carefully attaching their miniature flags to wooden dowels, painting stars in silver glitter, adding ribbons in patriotic colors. Their grandmother had helped them research the proper way to display the flag, teaching them the reverence that came with honoring the symbol of their country. The children's mother, Dr. Sarah Jenkins, emerged from behind the community center's brick wall, where she had been setting up folding chairs for the afternoon's Independence Day celebration. Her medical scrubs suggested she had just finished a shift at the county hospital, rushing to join her children for what should have been a joyful family tradition. The sight that greeted her smoke, still rising from her children's destroyed decorations, while Patricia stood smugly nearby, froze her in place for exactly 3 seconds before rage took over. "What the hell did you just do to my children?" Sarah's voice carried across the park with surgical precision, each word cutting through the ambient noise of families preparing for the holiday festivities. She had dealt with enough trauma in the emergency room to recognize the shell-shocked expressions on her children's faces, the same look she saw on victims of senseless violence. Patricia turned toward Sarah with the practiced condescension of someone accustomed to wielding authority without question. As president of the Oakwood Heights Homeowners Association, she had grown comfortable treating every interaction as an opportunity to assert dominance. Her pale blue eyes swept over Sarah's appearance, taking in the rumpled scrubs, the exhausted posture of someone who had worked a double shift, the protective stance of a mother whose cubs had been threatened. "I'm maintaining community standards," Patricia replied, her tone suggesting she was explaining something obvious to someone particularly slow. These children were creating a public disturbance with inappropriate displays. The HOA guidelines clearly state that flag displays must be approved in advance and conform to proper specifications. Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had moved to Oakwood Heights specifically for its reputation as a family-friendly community, accepting a higher mortgage payment in exchange for good schools and safe neighborhoods. The last thing she had expected was to encounter someone who would terrorize children on Independence Day, destroying their expressions of patriotism while hiding behind bureaucratic nonsense. "They're 7 and 9 years old," Sarah said, her voice dropping to the dangerous quiet that seasoned nurses used when dealing with combative patients. "They made those flags in art class to celebrate their country. What kind of person burns children's craft projects?" Patricia's smile remained perfectly frozen, the kind of expression that suggested she had practiced it in mirrors until it became a weapon. The kind of person who understands that respect must be earned, not simply claimed. Perhaps if you spent less time working and more time teaching your children proper community values, we wouldn't have this problem. The insult hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had been pulling extra shifts at the hospital to pay for Marcus's speech therapy, working nights and weekends to ensure her children had every opportunity for success. The suggestion that her dedication to providing for her family somehow disqualified her children from expressing patriotism felt like a knife twisting in an already open wound. From across the park, Other families began to notice the confrontation. The Rodriguez family, who had been setting up their portable grill, stopped their preparations to watch. Mrs. Chen, who had been hanging red, white, and blue streamers between two oak trees, paused with her decorations half finished. The Thompsons, recent retirees who volunteered at every community event, abandoned their coolers full of ice cream to move closer to the unfolding drama. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "We learned about the flag in school. Mrs. Peterson said it represents freedom for everyone." Patricia's laugh was sharp and brittle, like breaking glass. "Freedom is something adults understand. Sweetheart, children play with toys. Adults earn the right to display symbols of national pride through service, through contribution, through proving they deserve to be part of something greater than themselves." Amelia stepped forward, her small chin raised in defiance despite the tears still drying on her cheeks. "My daddy died for that flag. Mommy showed us his medal." The park fell silent, except for the distant sound of firecrackers and the steady hum of cicadas in the summer heat. Even Patricia seemed momentarily taken aback by the child's declaration, though she recovered quickly, her expression hardening into something even more cruel. "Then perhaps you should honor his memory by learning proper respect instead of waving around cheap trinkets," Patricia said, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure the gathering crowd could hear every word. "Real patriots don't need to prove anything with flashy displays." Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. A protective fury, unlike anything she had experienced even during her most challenging medical emergencies. The fact that this woman would use her deceased husband's military service as an excuse to humiliate her children crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She took a step forward, her body language shifting from defensive to aggressive, when a new voice cut through the tension like a calm blade through chaos. "I believe those children's flag display was perfectly appropriate for today's celebration." The speaker was a man in his early 40s, wearing a simple navy polo shirt and khaki shorts that suggested he belonged to the neighborhood's more casual demographic. His hair showed early gray at the temples, and his posture carried the subtle confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to when he spoke. He had emerged from the walking path that connected the park to the residential streets, a coffee cup in one hand and what appeared to be a folded newspaper in the other. Patricia's attention shifted to this new participant with obvious irritation. She had been successfully dominating the conversation until his interruption, and his calm tone suggested he wouldn't be easily intimidated by her usual tactics. "This is a private community matter," Patricia informed him with the tone she might use to dismiss a door-to-door salesman. "I'm handling a homeowners association issue." The man took a sip of his coffee and smiled with the kind of patient expression that suggested he had dealt with his share of difficult people in professional settings. Actually, destroying flags in a public park makes it everyone's concern, especially when children are involved. Patricia's eyes narrowed as she studied this unexpected challenger. She didn't recognize him from any HOA meetings, which meant he was either new to the neighborhood or belonged to the category of residents who paid their dues but avoided community politics. Either way, she had no intention of allowing him to undermine her authority in front of witnesses. "The flags were improperly displayed without HOA approval," Patricia said, her voice rising slightly as she felt control of the situation slipping away. "I have every right to enforce community standards." The man's expression remained pleasant, though something shifted in his eyes that Sarah recognized from her own experience, dealing with difficult patients, the look of someone whose professional patience was being tested. "I'm curious about the specific community standard that requires advance approval for children to carry small flags on Independence Day." Patricia reached into her designer handbag and produced a thick folder bound with elastic bands. the kind of documentation that suggested she came prepared for bureaucratic warfare. Section 12 of the Community Guidelines clearly states that all patriotic displays must conform to specified dimensions and receive written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. She flipped through pages with the practiced efficiency of someone who had weaponized homeowners association rules into a system of personal control. The other families gathered around the confrontation exchanged glances that suggested this wasn't Patricia's first time using HOA regulations to terrorize her neighbors. "Here," Patricia announced triumphantly, pointing to a specific paragraph buried in dense legal language. "No patriotic decorations exceeding 6 inches in any dimension may be displayed without prior written consent. These flags clearly violated the size restrictions." The man set down his coffee cup on a nearby picnic table and extended his hand toward Patricia's folder. "May I see that document?" Patricia clutched the folder against her chest with obvious reluctance. The Architectural Review Guidelines represented her primary source of power within the community, the weapon she used to maintain order according to her personal vision of suburban perfection. Allowing others to examine her authority felt dangerous. "I don't see why that's necessary," she said, though her tone lacked the confidence she had displayed moments earlier. "I'm perfectly capable of interpreting community standards." The man's smile remained steady, but his voice carried a subtle shift that suggested he was transitioning from neighborly conversation to something more official. "I'm sure you are. I'd just like to verify the language you're citing." Sarah watched this exchange with growing fascination. Something about the stranger's demeanor suggested he had experience dealing with people who used bureaucratic authority to intimidate others. His calm persistence reminded her of the medical examiners she had worked with, professionals who specialized in methodically uncovering truth despite attempts at concealment. Patricia reluctantly handed over the folder, her fingers lingering on the elastic bands, as if she could somehow maintain control by delaying the transfer. The man accepted the documents with the kind of careful attention that suggested he was accustomed to reviewing legal materials professionally. He opened the folder and began reading with the systematic thoroughness of someone trained to identify inconsistencies in written policies. His finger traced lines of text, while Patricia fidgeted nearby, her earlier confidence evaporating as the silence stretched longer than she had anticipated. "Interesting," the man said finally, his tone neutral but somehow ominous. "This section refers specifically to permanent installations on private property, garden flags, decorative banners, architectural modifications. Nothing about temporary displays in public spaces." Patricia's face flushed red beneath her carefully applied makeup. The spirit of the regulation clearly applies to all flag displays within community boundaries. "Does it?" the man continued reading, his finger stopping at another section near the bottom of the page. "Because this paragraph specifically exempts handheld patriotic items during recognized national holidays from any size or approval restrictions." The gathering crowd began to murmur among themselves as the legal foundation for Patricia's actions crumbled in real time. Several parents who had been watching from a distance moved closer, their children trailing behind with expressions of confused curiosity. "Mrs. Rodriguez spoke up from the edge of the group, her voice carrying the slight accent that marked her as one of the community's more recent residents. "You mean she had no right to destroy those children's flags?" The man closed the folder and handed it back to Patricia with deliberate ceremony. "Not only did she have no right, but destroying symbols of national patriotism could constitute several different federal violations." Patricia snatched the folder back with enough force to scatter several loose papers across the grass. Her carefully maintained composure was disintegrating rapidly as the implications of the stranger's words sank in. "Federal violations. That's ridiculous. I was enforcing community standards." "Federal law takes a dim view of destroying American flags. regardless of the excuse," the man replied, his tone becoming noticeably cooler. "Especially when the destruction is motivated by discrimination against specific community members." Sarah felt her heart begin to race as she recognized the direction this conversation was heading. The stranger's knowledge of federal law, his calm professionalism when confronted with bureaucratic intimidation, his systematic approach to examining legal documents all suggested someone with significant experience in the justice system. "Who are you?" Patricia demanded, her voice pitched higher than before as panic began to override her sense of superiority. The man reached into his back pocket and produced a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a badge and identification card with the practiced motion of someone who had done this countless times. David Hensley, Veterans Affairs Office of the Inspector General, Federal Prosecutor specializing in cases involving discrimination against military families and destruction of patriotic symbols. The silence that followed his identification was so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. Even the distant sounds of other Independence Day celebrations seemed to fade as the weight of Patricia's situation became clear to everyone present. Patricia's face went from flushed red to pale white in the span of seconds, her earlier arrogance replaced by obvious terror. I was just... The community guidelines clearly..." "The community guidelines don't override federal law," David said, returning his badge to his pocket with deliberate slowness. "And burning American flags while telling military children they haven't earned the right to display them constitutes multiple violations that fall directly under my jurisdiction." Sarah found herself struggling to process the sudden reversal of fortune. What had begun as a devastating attack on her children's innocent patriotism had transformed into a federal case with a prosecutor who specialized in exactly this type of discrimination. The odds of such a coincidence seemed impossibly small. David turned toward Sarah and her children with an expression of genuine concern. "I'm sorry you and your family had to experience this. No child should have their expression of patriotism destroyed, especially on Independence Day." Marcus looked up at David with wide eyes that still showed traces of tears. "Are you going to arrest her for burning our flags?" David knelt down to bring himself to the boy's eye level, his voice gentle but serious. "I'm going to make sure she faces appropriate consequences for what she did. What she did was wrong. And there are laws to protect families like yours from this kind of treatment." Patricia made a sound that might have been a whimper or a protest, her hands fluttering uselessly as she tried to formulate some kind of defense. "This is all a misunderstanding. I was protecting community values. I never intended..." "You burned children's flags while telling them they hadn't earned the right to display them," David interrupted, rising to face her directly. "You used your position in the Homeowners Association to intimidate a military family. You destroyed symbols of national patriotism on Independence Day. Your intentions are irrelevant compared to your actions." The crowd of neighbors had grown larger as word of the confrontation spread through the park. Sarah recognized faces from school pickup lines, grocery store encounters, the casual interactions that comprised suburban life. Many of them were recording the scene with their phones, apparently understanding that they were witnessing something historically significant for their community. Mrs. Chen stepped forward from the crowd, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had lived through enough history to recognize injustice when she saw it. "I've been watching Patricia intimidate families for 3 years. She uses those HOA rules like weapons against anyone she doesn't think belongs here." Several other neighbors nodded in agreement, their expressions suggesting this was the first time they felt safe expressing criticism of Patricia's leadership. The presence of a federal prosecutor had apparently shifted the power dynamic enough to allow suppressed grievances to surface. Mr. Thompson, the retired volunteer coordinator, spoke up with obvious anger in his voice. She made the Patel family remove their Diwali decorations last year, claiming they violated the aesthetic standards. She told them Indian holidays weren't appropriate for an American neighborhood. Patricia's terror deepened as she realized her neighbors were publicly documenting years of discriminatory behavior in front of a federal prosecutor. Each testimony was another nail in the coffin of her defense. Another piece of evidence that her actions weren't isolated mistakes, but part of a systematic pattern of targeting minority families. "She made us take down our pride flag during June," added a young man Sarah recognized from the coffee shop near the community center. "Said it was political propaganda that violated the community's family-friendly image." David listened to each account with the focused attention of someone building a legal case, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates, witnesses, and documentation. His expression grew steadily grimmer as the scope of Patricia's discriminatory behavior became clear. "This isn't about one incident anymore," he said, his voice carrying the weight of official judgment. "This is a pattern of civil rights violations that's been ongoing for years." Patricia seemed to shrink in on herself as the full magnitude of her situation became apparent. The Homeowners Association presidency that had given her a sense of power and importance was now the source of potential federal charges. Her carefully constructed authority was crumbling in real time, witnessed by the very neighbors she had spent years intimidating. "I need to call my lawyer," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. "That's your right," David agreed. "You're also going to need to explain your actions to the FBI's Civil Rights Division, the Veterans Affairs Office of the Inspector General, and, quite possibly, a federal grand jury." Amelia tugged on her mother's scrubs, her young voice cutting through the adult conversation with simple clarity. "Mommy, does this mean we can have our flags back?" Sarah looked down at her daughter's expectant face. Then, at the charred remains of their morning's craft project scattered across the grass. The flags themselves were beyond recovery, but something more important had been salvaged from Patricia's destructive rampage. "We'll make new ones, baby," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "Even better ones." David reached into his car, which Sarah now noticed was parked nearby with government plates, and returned with a small box from his trunk. Inside were several pristine American flags of various sizes, along with wooden dowels and assembly supplies. "I always carry these for community events," he explained, offering the box to Marcus and Amelia. "Veterans Affairs sponsors flag education programs in schools. I was actually coming to this park to set up a display table for the afternoon celebration." The children's faces lit up as they examined the new flags, their earlier trauma beginning to fade in the face of this unexpected gift. Marcus carefully selected a medium-sized flag with bright colors and sharp-edged stars, while Amelia chose one with ribbons that would flutter attractively in the summer breeze. Patricia watched this exchange with growing desperation, apparently realizing that her victims were being publicly celebrated while she faced potential federal prosecution. The narrative had shifted completely away from her version of events, and there was no longer any possibility of controlling the situation through bureaucratic intimidation. "This is entrapment," she said suddenly, her voice rising with panic. "You were planning this somehow. You can't just show up and destroy someone's life because of a simple misunderstanding." David's expression remained calm, though something cold flickered in his eyes. "I live in this neighborhood, Mrs. Whitmore. My house is on Maple Street, 3 blocks from here. I was walking to the park to participate in my community's Independence Day celebration when I witnessed you terrorizing children and destroying their patriotic displays." The revelation that David was actually a resident of Oakwood Heights added another layer of significance to the confrontation. This wasn't an outside authority figure interfering in community affairs. This was a neighbor who had witnessed discrimination against local families and had both the responsibility and the authority to address it. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude mixed with amazement at the unlikely turn of events. Her children's worst experience with community prejudice had suddenly become their most powerful lesson in how justice could prevail when good people refused to remain silent. "What happens now?" she asked David, her voice still trembling slightly from the emotional intensity of the morning's events. David glanced around at the gathered neighbors, many of whom were still recording the conversation on their phones. "Now, Mrs. Whitmore faces the legal consequences of her actions, while your family enjoys the Independence Day celebration you came here to have." He turned back to Patricia, whose carefully styled appearance had begun to wilt under the summer heat and stress of her situation. "I'll be filing a preliminary report with my office this afternoon. You can expect to be contacted by federal investigators within the next few days." Patricia opened her mouth as if to protest, then seemed to realize that anything she said would only make her situation worse. Instead, she gathered her scattered papers with shaking hands and walked quickly toward the parking lot, her high heels clicking erratically against the concrete pathway. The crowd of neighbors watched her retreat with expressions ranging from satisfaction to amazement. Several people began talking among themselves about their own experiences with Patricia's discriminatory enforcement of HOA rules, apparently feeling free to discuss them openly for the first time. Mrs. Rodriguez approached Sarah with obvious sympathy. "I'm so sorry you and your children had to experience that. Patricia has made life difficult for many families, but no one knew how to stop her." Sarah accepted the woman's kindness gratefully, though her attention remained focused on her children, who were carefully assembling their new flags with the concentrated attention that suggested they understood the significance of what had just occurred. "The important thing is that it's over now," Sarah replied, watching Marcus help Amelia attach ribbons to her flagpole. "My children learned that their country has laws to protect them, and that good people will stand up for what's right." David finished making notes in a small notebook, then approached the family with an expression of professional concern. "I'll need to get statements from you and your children for the official report. Nothing too formal, just descriptions of what happened from your perspective." Sarah nodded, understanding that her children's testimony would be crucial for any federal case against Patricia. The fact that they had witnessed not just destruction of property, but specifically discriminatory targeting of military families would carry significant weight in court. "Will we have to testify in court?" she asked, thinking about the potential trauma of forcing her children to relive the morning's events in a formal legal setting. "Possibly," David admitted, "but federal prosecutors work hard to minimize stress on child witnesses. Most likely, your written statements will be sufficient, especially with all the additional testimony from other neighborhood families." The morning sun had climbed higher while they talked, and the park was beginning to fill with families arriving for the official Independence Day festivities. Red, white, and blue decorations were appearing throughout the area as volunteers prepared for the afternoon celebration. Marcus looked up from his flag assembly project with a question that revealed how much he had absorbed from the adult conversation. "Will Mrs. Whitmore go to jail for burning our flags?" David considered the question seriously, understanding that his answer would help shape the boy's understanding of justice and consequences. "She'll face appropriate punishment for what she did. The exact consequences will depend on the investigation and the legal process." Amelia finished attaching her ribbons and held up her completed flag for inspection. The morning sunlight caught the fabric and made the colors seem to glow with symbolic significance. "Can we put these in the parade now?" "Absolutely," Sarah said, feeling tears of relief and pride welling in her eyes. "We're going to march in this parade and wave these flags with more pride than anyone else here." Over the following weeks, The consequences of Patricia's actions unfolded with the inexorable momentum of federal justice. The FBI's Civil Rights Division opened a formal investigation into discriminatory practices within the Oakwood Heights Homeowners Association. The Veterans Affairs Office of the Inspector General filed charges related to harassment of military families and destruction of patriotic symbols. Patricia's attempts to defend her actions only made her situation worse. Her lawyer advised her to remain silent, but she couldn't resist giving interviews to local media in which she portrayed herself as a victim of government overreach. Each appearance provided additional evidence of her discriminatory attitudes and lack of remorse for terrorizing children. The Homeowners Association held an emergency meeting to distance itself from Patricia's actions and implement new policies preventing discriminatory enforcement of community rules. A review committee was established with representatives from all demographic groups within the neighborhood to ensure fair treatment of residents. Patricia was ultimately convicted on federal charges, including destruction of patriotic symbols, civil rights violations, and harassment of military families. She received a sentence that included significant fines, community service, and prohibition from holding any position of authority within homeowners associations. More importantly, for the community, her conviction sent a clear message that discriminatory behavior would not be tolerated, regardless of bureaucratic justifications or claims of enforcing standards. Other residents who had been victims of similar treatment came forward to share their experiences, leading to additional investigations and reforms. Sarah and her children became symbols of resilience within the community, their story spreading beyond Oakwood Heights to inspire other families facing discrimination. Marcus and Amelia's flags, destroyed in hatred but rebuilt through justice, represented the enduring power of American ideals when defended by people of conscience. On the following Independence Day, Sarah organized a community flag-making workshop where children of all backgrounds created patriotic displays together. The event was held in the same park where Patricia had tried to destroy her children's expression of patriotism, transforming a site of trauma into a celebration of inclusivity and justice. David Hensley became a regular presence at community events, his expertise in civil rights law serving as both protection and education for residents. His intervention had not only saved one family from discrimination, but had fundamentally changed the character of the entire neighborhood. The empty lot where Patricia's house had stood after she was forced to sell to pay legal fees became a community garden where families of all backgrounds worked together to grow vegetables and flowers. Children played among the plants while their parents shared stories and built the kind of genuine community that Patricia's version of order had never been able to create. As evening fell on that first Independence Day after Patricia's conviction, Sarah stood in the same park where her children's flags had been burned, watching Marcus and Amelia run through the grass with new friends from across the neighborhood. The fireworks beginning to burst overhead seemed to celebrate not just national freedom, but the personal liberation that comes when justice prevails over prejudice. The lessons learned that day would echo through the community for years to come, teaching children that their country's symbols belong to everyone who calls America home, and that there are always people willing to defend that principle when it comes under attack. Patricia's attempt to define patriotism through exclusion had instead revealed patriotism's true meaning, the courage to stand up for justice, especially when defending those who cannot defend themselves. In the end, the price of freedom proved to be exactly what it had always been, the willingness of good people to confront injustice wherever they find it, regardless of the cost to themselves. Sarah's children learned that lesson not from textbooks or speeches, but from witnessing their community come together to protect what mattered most. Their flags, burned in hatred but reborn in hope, would forever represent the truth that democracy's strength lies not in its perfection, but in its capacity for renewal through the actions of ordinary citizens who refuse to let injustice have the final word.